Hey, welcome to The Explainer. So, The Art of War, you've heard of it, right? It's one of the most famous books on strategy ever written. But what if I told you that its legendary author, the brilliant General Sun Tzu, might never have existed at all? Today, we're digging into the incredible story and the deep historical mystery behind this ancient classic. If you love a good puzzle, you're definitely in the right place. So, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button and like this explainer. Okay, so here's how we're going to break this down. We're going to treat this whole thing like a detective story. First, we'll look at the famous legend of Sun Tzu. Then, we'll uncover a huge historical mystery. We'll hunt for clues that are actually hidden inside the book itself, see how it almost got completely lost in translation. And finally, we'll talk about its unbelievable legacy. All right, so our investigation kicks off with the oldest and most well-known story about Sun Tzu's life. It was written by the great historian Ssu-ma way back around 100 BC. And honestly, it reads less like a dry historical account and more like the opening scene of some epic movie. And this quote, this really gets to the heart of the most famous story about him. So the king of Wu basically says, "Prove your skills. Train my 180 palace concubines to be soldiers." As you can imagine, when he gives them their first commands, they just start laughing. Sun Tzu's logic was, well, terrifyingly simple. He said, "My orders were clear, so if the troops disobey, it's the officer's fault." And who were the officers? The king's two favorite concubines. He had them executed, right there on the spot. It was a brutal, shocking lesson in accountability that instantly showed everyone he meant business. So after that pretty dramatic demonstration, the king was sold. He immediately made Sun Tzu a general. And Ssu-ma tells us he went on to lead the armies of Wu to this legendary victory over their biggest rival, the state of Chu. The story gives us a really clear picture. Sun Tzu was a real guy, and his ruthless methods got results. But here, this is where our nice, clean story starts to fall apart and becomes a real mystery. Because when you look at the most important historical text that was actually written during that period, there's just a massive, gaping hole where Sun Tzu is supposed to be. And this chart just lays out the problem perfectly. Ssu-ma history, written centuries later, is packed with these vivid details about Sun Tzu. But the Sochuan, which is the definitive chronicle written at the time, says absolutely nothing about him, not a word. And this is a record that goes into detail about the careers of all sorts of other, even minor officials from that era. So how on earth could it have completely missed the military genius who won Wu's greatest victory? This total silence, it's just baffling. And it forces us to ask the biggest question of all. Is it possible that the man who supposedly wrote the world's most influential book on military strategy never even existed? So, to try and figure this out, we've got to become detectives ourselves. Let's turn to the biggest piece of evidence we have, the actual text of The Art of War. We're going to see what clues we can find just by analyzing the words on the page. Now, this quote is really fascinating because it's a critical clue. You see, the author keeps using the states of Wu and Yue as his go-to example of sworn enemies. Over and over, he frames Yue as the main adversary to his own state, Wu. And that little detail, well, it turns out to be a really big deal. Just take a look at this timeline. The legend says Sun Tzu's career peaked in 506 BC when he defeated the state of Chu. Back then, Chu was Wu's #1 enemy. The serious rivalry with Yu, that didn't really explode until after that campaign. So the book's constant focus on Yu strongly suggests it was written in this later period, which totally contradicts the timeline of the legend. But of course, it's not that simple, because while the timeline seems off, other clues in the book tie it firmly to this early period. The author talks about an old land system, he focuses on chariot warfare, which went out of style later, and he clearly writes as a man of Wu, a state that was literally wiped off the map in 473 BC. So the book feels authentic to the era, even if the legend about its author doesn't quite add up. You know, the mystery of who wrote the book is just one part of the story. The incredible and kind of perilous journey the book itself took to reach us today, that's a whole other adventure. Its survival was never a sure thing. The book's introduction to the West was, frankly, a complete disaster. The first translation into a European language was French, back in 1782. But the great 20th century scholar Lionel Giles later said it was little better than an imposture, basically a fraud. He said it was full of stuff Sun Tzu never wrote and missing almost everything he actually did. And it didn't get any better with the first shot at an English version in 1905. Giles was even tougher on this one, calling it excessively bad. He said the translator just skipped the hard parts or twisted their meaning to say whatever he wanted. The original genius of the text was just being totally butchered. It really wasn't until dedicated scholars like Lionel Giles came along that we got a version of The Art of War in English that was actually true to the original. He had to painstakingly compare all these different ancient Chinese sources to put it back together correctly. And it's a great reminder that without that kind of rigorous, honest work, all this ancient wisdom can just be twisted or lost forever. So in the end, whether Sun Tzu was one real person, or maybe a name given to the work of several strategists, or just a myth, it almost doesn't matter, because the ideas in that book took on a life of their own, and they've been shaping history for thousands of years. I mean, for over 2,000 years, a who's who of the greatest military minds in Chinese history have studied this book. We're talking about legends like Han Xin, the famous Cao Cao, and so many others. For generations of generals and leaders, these pages have been the absolute bedrock of strategic thinking. And that kind of leaves us with one last big question to think about. The story of the man might be a mystery, but the wisdom in the book is undeniable. So, which is more important, the name on the cover or the timeless power of the ideas inside? Thanks so much for joining me on The Explainer. If you had fun on this little historical investigation, don't forget to like this explainer and subscribe for more.